Everyone wants to find unique ways to stand out and things they're doing differently. But the reality is a lot of you are going to look very similar on paper. And that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. You all have to go get the same requirements, right? There's only so much you can do that's differently. But one thing I want to make sure I definitely point out is don't lie. I mean, people are actually kind of honest to me about it. They're like, yeah, Jenny, I put this, but I'm not nervous now because technically I haven't been on my own. Even though when I oriented, I watched my preceptor do ECMO. I haven't done ECMO, but I put out my resume and I'm like, oh, what? Why? Anything you put on your resume, you guys, is fair game for them to say, oh, you listed it, you must be well-versed in it, right? If you're going to put it on your resume. I mean, that's the way they take it when you put it on your resume. If you put ECMO, but you truly have never been trained to do ECMO, but you watched your preceptor do it a few times, you may be opening a giant can of worms.
I'm Jenny Finnell, CRNA and founder of CRNA School Prep Academy. I have always had a passion for helping those who aspire to become a CRNA. A couple of years ago, I started mentoring a handful of prospective students. Fast forward to today, and I have a successful mentoring program that has impacted hundreds of aspiring and now current nurse anesthesia students. What I enjoy the most in my business is connecting with you, the future CRNA. I love learning and growing with you. The road to CRNA is full of unique challenges, and no two journeys are the same. But every journey has a learning opportunity. I'm here to share what I have learned over the years from not just my students, but CRNA community leaders, program faculty, and from my time as a practicing CRNA. This will be your one-stop shop to get the mentoring you need to not only guide you into this career path, but support you all the way through to graduation day. So if you're a nursing student who's exploring the possibility, an ICU nurse actively pursuing CRNA, or a current nurse anesthesia student, you're in the right place. Tune in for inspiration and actionable takeaways that will help you from start to finish. Let's get started.
Welcome back to another episode of CRNA School Prep Academy. I'm your host, Jenny Finnell, CRNA, and we're going to discuss preparing your resume for CRNA school and some of the things that you should avoid, as well as some things that you should be thinking about, like little nuances, I would call them, so that you're making a good impression. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that when you guys start doing your resume for CRNA school, that you are not treating this process like checking a box. They will be able to tell if that is the case. It'll essentially make it look like you are not putting a full amount of effort into it, or that maybe even you're not the most serious applicant. So make sure that when you work on your resume, that again, that you're kind of putting a lot of effort and time into making sure that it's just easy to read, it flows nice, it's well organized, and that you 100 million times triple check the spelling. I use Grammarly. I don't know. There's a free version of it. Just copy and paste and stick it in Grammarly real quick, because if you're like me, I make typos without even realizing I made them. So I will literally reread something like 5 times and be like, how did I not see that? So I use Grammarly a lot for that reason. So I get it. It's sometimes it's hard to proofread your own stuff because your brain is plugging in words that aren't actually there, or it's correcting the mistake because that's what you meant to say, but you didn't type it out that way. So make sure you have someone else lay eyes on your resume too. Have, your coworker, your friend, your mom, dad, whoever. You can also do a resume review with CRNA School Prep Academy's expert providers. So that's always an option as well. I will definitely link to that below in the show notes. But yeah, make sure again that you're putting a lot of effort into your resume, because kind of if you think about an invitation to a wedding or an invitation to anything for that matter, it's kind of like your first impression. And I hate to say, you always say don't judge a book by its cover, but the reality is people do and will kind of judge you based on your resume, right? That's kind of their first impression of you. They don't know you. They don't know your personality. And there's something to be said with actually physically hearing someone speak and telling the tone of voice, their eye contact, all of those things that really go into how you display yourself, where a piece of paper just can't usually do you justice. So you have to really go above and beyond to make sure when someone's reading a piece of paper, if they're in a bad mood or had a bad experience and they go into reading your resume, that you're going to make them smile somehow, versus, again, they're not going to know you or not going to hear a tone of voice or anything like that. So I think one of the most going into like things that mistakes people make when they do their resume is they want to highlight their clinical experience, and they tend to do this in place of their education. That is a mistake. If you think about it, you're applying to grad school. You're not applying to a job. Now, if you took your old template from when you were applying to your ICU position, maybe it mattered more about your work experience as a nurse's aide, right? Because you're applying to a work position. You're applying to work as a nurse versus you're not applying to school to go work as a nurse. You're applying to school. So your educational background really should be front and center. And the other reason why you should really put your education at the very top of your resume versus going right into your clinical experience is because it's going to be a shorter section. It's going to be more concise to the point. And if you were to put that at the end of your resume, they have to read through all your clinical stuff just to find your education. It's by the time they get there, they may just kind of skim over it real quick, and you're not going to be able to highlight your accomplishments as well. And again, remember you're applying to grad school for a grad school position. So highlight your educational background. Where did you get the degree? So the name of your school. When did you graduate? And not just the year. Some people make this mistake where they put, I graduated in 2020. Well, did you graduate in May of 2020 or December of 2020? Because this really can say, oh, they graduated in May of 2020, so they have 6 more months of experience versus someone who graduated in December of 2020. So just differentiate yourself, make it known like, oh, I graduated, but I graduated in January of 2020. So I had an entire year of 2020 with experience under my belt. How well did you do? I get asked this question a lot as far as should you be placing your GPA on your resume? And the answer can kind of go both ways. I do think if you have a 3.5 or higher, you should definitely be highlighting that on your resume. I mean, at the end of the day, you guys are going to be reviewing your transcripts and calculating your GPA regardless. So if you don't do this step, it's perfectly okay. But I think, again, if it's something like if you're a B+ student on average and you have a 3.5, I think you should highlight that. Why not? It's going to take up very little room, and you might as well just highlight it. But, if you have someone who has maybe a 3.0, 3.2, this could be something that maybe it's just better left off the resume. Again, they're going to be calculating your GPA with your transcripts anyways. But it gives you space to really highlight other things, like maybe you were given an award, or maybe you served on a committee in nursing school, something like that. So make sure that you're using your resume to highlight your strength. That's always what your resume is all about. So again, that's kind of explains as far as highlighting your GPA and things like that. As far as I know, some of you are taking different routes, right, to become a nurse. Some of you have gotten your ADN, then your BSN. Some of you have a bachelor's in biology, and then you get an accelerated BSN. So depending on what you do, make sure you put your most current schooling up top, meaning if you had your ADN and got your BSN should be at the top of the page versus the other way around. You should always go with the most current ICU experience, current education experience, degree at the top, and then kind of list the older experience below that. And also another tip is spell out your degrees, such as like a bachelor's. You put bachelor's degree in biology versus BS in biology. That's just kind of a nuance that, again, Mr. Richard Wilson pointed out to me that as a faculty member, he appreciates seeing things spelled out. It doesn't take up a lot of room on your resume, and it just sounds and looks better. So, and same thing, if you had, cum laude, things like that, you can definitely put that on your resume. And then also another piece of advice that was kind of given by Dr. Dawn Abushan, who has also been a program director for several years and is now a program faculty at a CRNA college. If you're in a current course, because a lot of you are taking courses, right? And you're like, oh, should I list individual courses? I don't get a degree at this college, but I took individual courses there. You don't need to list individual courses if it's going to reflect on your transcripts. But if you're currently in a course and it's not going to reflect on your transcripts because when you submitted your transcripts, the course hasn't finished, you definitely can and should highlight the course you're in. And what I would recommend, and what these program faculty have recommended, is for you to approach your professor wherever you're at in the course and ask them for just a short letter that they can sign that says, such and such is in X, Y, and Z course, is such and such into the semester. I anticipate them getting X grade in the course. Have them anticipate what they think your final grade will be as long as you keep performing as you have been performing in the course. It's kind of like an unofficial way of them saying, I anticipate the student to achieve an A- or achieve an A or achieve a B+, whatever it may be. And it just kind of shows these schools that you are kind of taking something additional so they don't miss it. Because again, after you actually have completed the course, you could submit that course to go into your overall GPA as long as they're able to take things after the deadline. This is something, again, that you can reach out to the program and let them know, hey, is it possible for me to submit this course after I take it, even though the deadline for applications is X date, 2 weeks later, I'm gonna have my final grade. I can submit an anticipated grade, and then once my transcripts, once this course is complete and it reflects on my transcripts, I can submit that. A lot of schools will take that into consideration, so something to think about. But don't think you have to list all these individual courses you've done at different schools as long as it reflects on your transcripts. So that's just something also to think about. But again, I've heard this argued both ways but again, just make sure that your transcripts are solid, review your transcripts, don't just submit them and not look at them. I've had students that's happened where they think they take their transcripts from a school and submit it, and then they come to find afterwards they didn't submit all their transcripts like they thought they did. So make sure you're laying eyeballs on your transcripts, especially if you're submitting from multiple schools. You don't want something to get missed. You can list things like honors, societies, rewards, committees, but you don't have to actually put, what you actually did, but just list the fact that you have received such rewards or you served on the Student Nurse Association for your college, that kind of thing. You can list that kind of stuff there. And again, along the lines of like cum laude, magna cum laude, things like that in that area. So that, again, should be front and center because you're applying to grad school. The next big question that, again, people always ask me, they're like, well, Jenny, how long should a resume be? What's the difference between a resume and a CV, a curriculum vitae? And the short answer is they're using these terms interchangeably. So there's really not much difference for the way you're going to be using a resume versus a CV. If you want to know the technical difference, it's the CV is more used for, say, like someone who's going to get a PhD, for example, and they have all this research they want to highlight in their resume. They could be 10, 20, 30 pages long. So a CV doesn't really have a length requirement. It can really be as long as you need it to be, versus a resume is really designed to be more of a short one-page summary of your experience. So that's the technical difference. Again, schools will use this term interchangeably. If they say CV, it doesn't mean they want a book from you. Based on the faculty that I have spoke to, most of them have recommended trying your best to keep your CV or resume to 2 pages max. And you also got to keep in mind that these schools sometimes are getting 150, 200 applicants for like 30 positions. And so again, these program faculty are going to be scanning over 100 resumes. And so sometimes they have to get through it. And the longer you make your resume, they may just start to skim towards the end, right? They may just focus on that first page, look at the second one, but by the time they get to the third page, they're gonna be like, all right, it's just more of the same stuff. Like I'll move on, right, to the more next applicant. So keep in mind that the things that you put on the page, the end of page 2 and page 3 may not really get the attention. So make sure that, again, that if you're making your resume that long, that the things you're putting on the very last page are not things you want them to see, because they may not actually mentally capture that at that point. So yeah, that's the kind of the rundown on CV versus resume and page length and stuff like that. So when you are getting into your clinical experience, the most important tip I have as far as building out your resume this way is to make sure you're keeping it kind of formatted universally. Make sure you're using the same font and text size. And if you're going to put a date, like for example, like March 2020, and you use the numbers in a dash, don't then on the next section put March and, spell it out with 2022. Make sure you're sticking. If you're going to use numbers, use numbers. If you're going to spell it out throughout your resume. Just keep your formatting kind of universal and standard. It doesn't matter which one you choose, but just make sure it's not going to be different per bullet point. It's just going to seem kind of sloppy, ultimately, even though it might not be intended to be that way. It just will potentially come across as less professional. So again, making sure you're uniform, making sure, again, that your formatting is not such that, when you skip over to the next space, it's indented differently as far as where it lines up. Resumes can be tricky. I don't know how many times I've said bad words to my computer when I'm like, why is this doing this? The formatting is all messed up. I highly recommend to use a template. If you have Canva on Canva, I believe you can have a free Canva account. In fact, I know you can. I have a paid account because I use Canva like every day, but there are so many templates in Canva. CRNA School Prep Academy has templates as well. We even have examples of resumes for you to follow. But yeah, Canva, you guys, use a template. Like, don't stress yourself out, but also make sure keep it basic. Like, if you go on Canva, there's all kinds of like crazy resumes. Like, don't use bright. Just keep it basic. Like, you don't need anything bright and elaborate. Keep it neutral. You don't need anything crazy. And put in a picture, yay or nay. I mean, as long as it's not overwhelmingly huge on the page, I don't think it's a terrible thing, but I also think it kind of detracts from the overall purpose of the resume. Now, when you're applying for a job, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think applying for a job, I think having a little picture of yourself, especially if it's a professional shot, is really nice. But for grad school, I mean, I don't know how necessary it is, and if it takes up enough space to where you have less highlighting for you to do as far as your actual experience and what you're coming with, I think you should avoid it, in my personal opinion. Because again, it's not going to matter to them. They just want straight to the point, right? Where applying for a job, maybe it's a little more like, you're not taking 200 applicants for 30 positions or whatever that ends up working out. Maybe you are, I don't know. But I feel like for grad school, it's just keep it simple, right? I mean, I say that in anesthesia too. Keep it simple. It's the KISS method. Keep it simple, stupid. Because sometimes the more you try to embellish and elaborate, the more difficult something becomes, right? And so that's kind of the same thing with a resume. Like, basic is okay. It's okay if your resume is not pretty and all decorated with flowers and stuff. Like, that's okay. Like, in fact, it's more than likely preferred by the programs. So keep that in mind. But yeah, so when you get into the bullet points, as far as the skills that you've learned, keep in mind, always start with your most current experience at the top. I feel like now more than ever, people have so much travel experience on their resumes that they're like, holy shnikes, I have 12 places to list. And here's kind of what I can share with you from advice that has been given. Obviously, start with your most current experience at the top. Go into detail on that location, meaning really make a lot of bullet points on what you do. On the next positions, especially if they're very similar experiences, similar skills, you can summarize or shorten that, kind of thing, or just put the unique things, right? Like, maybe if at one facility you did this, but you didn't do it at the other facility, make sure you're putting that under that place. But if the rest of it's similar, again, you can consolidate to kind of save versus just copying and pasting the same things in every single, if you were to copy and paste all the same bullet points and just verbatim copy and paste, I wouldn't do that. That's just going to add tons of length to your resume. And it's going to be obvious that you're copying and pasting and you're not putting thought into what have you done differently at this site versus this site. So that's my advice as far as if you have a lot of different experiences. Make sure you're listing what makes that experience unique and different, but you don't necessarily have to repeat verbatim exactly what you repeated above for the other facility. But things like, when you monitor hemodynamics, special devices, whether that's CRT, ECMO, intracranial bolts, interventricular drains, etc., all those things, art lines, swans, make sure you're listing the types of devices you're using, that they're kind of unique and special to what experience you're getting. Keep in mind when you're talking about a current facility, by using past tense words like monitored, it sounds like, okay, well, you monitored in the past, you do not currently monitor them now. So you can use past tense for past experiences, but if you're at a current location, use active tense. I mean, it's something sounds pretty basic and pretty simple, but it does make a difference for the reader who's interpreting what they're reading. And trying to think what else. Vasoactive medications, Mr. Wilson, prefers medications over using the term like drugs. I don't know if that's just, could be a little nuance, but I would suggest that you take it to heart. Use the term medications versus the term drugs. Just sounds a little more formal, I guess. And also make sure you're not using slang terms. Don't abbreviate and use abbreviations. Like if you're going to put, levo, don't put levo, put levofed, again, and if you're going to pick, trade name versus generic name, pick one or the other. Don't flip-flop back and forth, kind of like what I spoke to before as far as sticking with one way. As long as you're using the medication term, that's okay, but make sure you're not interchangeably using both or kind of flipping back and forth, and spell out the whole. If you're using, a term, make sure you're spelling out the whole word. Don't just put benzos, right? Put benzodiazepines. Make sure you're actually spelling out the whole word when you're putting medications, if you were to list them specifically. But yeah, if you're in like sedatives, again, sedatives, you can say benzodiazepines, right? Because Versed is a benzodiazepine drip. Putting terms like vasopressors, vasoactive drugs versus medications, again, like I just spoke to. Also, if you're putting, vasopressors on there, you don't necessarily have to list out every single vasopressor you've ever used. It's okay if you have the space and you want to, you can, but know that you don't necessarily have to, as long as, you speak to the fact that you routinely use vasopressors and titrate those drips. That is okay. Also keep in mind too, based on where you put what you're doing, whether that's at the top, like, so say you have your hospital, the surgical unit you work on, the fact that you're an RN there, mark it as the most current date of experience to present, or when you started to present. And then starting on your first bullet point, put the skill and task that you think is the most valuable towards your CRNA school experience, right? The titrating vasoactive medications and monitoring and managing hemodynamics, special device management, things like that. Put those things, bullet points first, versus things like, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to poo-poo communication to family or poo-poo patient education. I think those are all very important things, but especially if you have a lot of different experiences, if you list that first and they start skimming, they may miss some more important bullet points as far as the fact that you're managing these advanced life support methods like ECMO and things like that. So I think you should be putting those bullet points top of the list and kind of saving the additional things like different unit leadership roles that you're doing as a bullet point for like kind of closer to the end. Same thing with patient education and things like that. I think put like your actual ICU critical skills that you have gained that's unique to the ICU first, and kind of follow up with the other things at the end. Other tips for when you're kind of writing things out is such that you want to make sure that you're not switching tenses. I know I mentioned speaking current versus past terms based on where you're working, but again, don't flip them, interchange them. Don't put monitored and monitoring in the same sentence. Or also too, if you're saying things like you are monitoring hemodynamics, and I think you should save titrating vasoactive medications for the next bullet point, right? Combining monitoring hemodynamics and titrating vasoactive medications. What if they read monitoring hemodynamics and they start like mentally skimming and then go to the next bullet point before they see the vasoactive medication titration? So make it its own bullet point. Again, it just kind of helps you stand out a little bit more. And you got to think about this in a sense that people are going to be reading this and trying to read it at lightning speed. It's like, squirrel, what's next? Again, they're going to have hundreds of applicants to kind of sort through, and they're human. These are not robots that are doing this. These are humans. And so make sure that you're kind of making it as edible as possible in the smallest chunks. Just like how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? When you're reading a resume, you're taking little chunks at a time. And so make it kind of help them take little chunks at a time, so they don't miss anything, especially if they're going to start going quicker towards the end of the actual piece of paper. And then you can also utilize a side to like place certifications like CCRN, CMC, things like that. You can actually, there's usually like a little sidebar on a resume that you can kind of place those types of things so they don't get lost at the very end of the resume. So yeah, that's kind of, again, my for the bulk of it, when you're doing all that, those are like kind of my big pieces of advice for you. is to, again, kind of use the sidebar as a way to kind of highlight things that maybe you wouldn't mention in the body of the resume. But ultimately, you guys, just don't be afraid to have someone else lay eyes on your resume. Keep in mind that, again, this is the first impression that you're making for the CRNA schools, and they're looking at several resumes. Now, I know probably all of you are like, well, how do I stand out? I know everyone wants to find unique ways to stand out and things they're doing differently, but the reality is a lot of you are going to look very similar on paper, and that's okay. It is what it is. You all have to get the same requirements, right? There's only so much you can do that's differently. But one thing I want to make sure I definitely point out is don't lie. I'm kind of surprised sometimes by people are actually kind of honest to me about it. They're like, yeah, Jenny, I put this, but I'm not nervous now because technically I haven't been on my own. Even though when I oriented, I watched my preceptor do ECMO. I haven't done ECMO, but I put out my resume and I'm like, oh, what? Why? Anything you put on your resume, you guys, is fair game for them to say, oh, you listed it. You must be well versed in it, right? If you're going to put it on your resume. That's the way they take it when you put it on your resume. If you put ECMO, but you truly have never been trained to do ECMO, but you watched your preceptor do it a few times, you maybe be opening a giant can of worms. You could get lucky, but if you get unlucky and they actually ask you about it and you can't fully explain how ECMO works because you truly have never actually done it, you're going to really burn yourself a hole. So be really, really careful. Just don't lie. That's the easiest way around it is just don't lie. And I actually think that if you're tempted to put something on your resume that you actually haven't really truly done because you think it's going to make you stand out, that's an indication or a red flag. That means that's an action item. That's something that you need to take action on. Nothing to be ashamed about, nothing to feel bad about. Shoot, if you just started in the ICU 6 months ago, cut yourself a little bit of a break. Sometimes it takes more than just 6 months to get trained in ECMO, right? You have to kind of get the feel and lay of the land and get oriented before they do advanced training. And all units are a little different as far as how soon they will be able to do that kind of training for you. It's okay. It's not going to make or break you getting into CRNA school. I can promise you that, but what will make or break you to get into CRNA school is if they catch you lying, right? So that's my piece of advice as far as trying to stand out. Just don't lie about it. And be sure that anything you put on your resume can be fair game to go into more detail. So everything you put on there, you guys, you have to understand it. If they say, well, you say you use ECMO, tell me about how ECMO works, or CRRT, or you mentioned that you routinely use vasopressin. How does vasopressin work? Whatever you put on your resume is kind of going to lead them down the direction. And a lot of these schools, what they'll do is during your actual interview, they will have your resume in hand. They will be looking at your resume yet again, and not just one person, the entire panel of people will have your resume, and they pull questions from that. May or may not. Sometimes they have a set bank of questions or favorite questions, for example. And some of these schools really hit heavily on emotional intelligence, but if they may see that you work in a neuro ICU, maybe just to throw you off your game, they'll ask you about a cardiac type of situation. What would you do? Because technically, as an ICU nurse, we all should be well versed in ACLS, right? And you're ACLS certified. So instead of asking you neuro ICU related questions, they may just take you down the rabbit hole of ACLS. And it's because it's on your resume and you're ACLS trained, so it's fair game. So I hope you guys found this episode insightful, helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in every week. I appreciate you. If you have not already, I really, really would appreciate if you could leave a review. It means a lot, and I will see you next week for another episode of CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. You guys take care. Bye-bye. Hey, future CRNA, as always, I appreciate you and your loyalty. Thank you so very much for tuning in this week. I'd love to hear from you, so screenshot this episode and share it to your IG stories with your biggest takeaway. Don't forget to tag me at CRNA School Prep Academy so I can personally thank you. Be sure to head over to CRNASchoolPrepAcademy.com to check out our blog and gather free resources to help you along your CRNA journey. Stay strong, and I'll see you next week.